This is history's edge. We do not use digital effects to rebuild lost cities. We do not rely on reenactments or dramatic music to make history feel important. Instead, we let the facts speak for themselves. In this documentary, we follow the rise and fall of Rome through its metals: iron and bronze, silver and gold, copper and lead. These were not just materials. They were tools of power. They armed soldiers, funded empires, and left traces in every province Rome touched. We will look at where these metals came from, how they were mined, how they were used, and what they meant to the people who lived in their shadow. From the first forged sword to the last imperial coin, this story follows the pulse of empire as it flowed through fire and ore. Every chapter is based on historical and archaeological research. There is no fiction here, no filler, just carefully sourced history, told plainly. This is not a story about myth. It is a story about matter. Let us begin. Chapter 1. Blood and Ore. Before the Empire, before the Republic, and long before the Forum, there was fire, stone, and metal. Rome began not as a city of laws, but as a cluster of settlements in the hills of Latium. Its rise would be long, and its greatness would come not only from ambition, but from what it could pull from the earth. The earliest traces of life on the Palatine Hill date to the 9th century before the Common Era. People lived in huts made of branches and clay. They raised livestock, stored grain, and buried their dead in simple graves. But in those graves, archaeologists have found more than bones. There were blades and pins, vessels and brooches, all made of bronze. That metal, an alloy of copper and tin, had to be brought in through trade routes that reached beyond the Italian peninsula. Even in its infancy, Rome relied on the movement and mastery of metal. To the north, in Etruria, metalwork was already a high art. The Etruscans had access to copper from the island of Elba and to rich veins of iron in the hills of Tuscany. They used furnaces fueled by charcoal and bellows to extract the ore and smelt it down. The slag piles they left behind are still visible today. Their metalwork was complex. They cast statues and tools, hammered helmets and shields, and inlaid weapons with silver and gold. When they buried their dead, they did so with care. Tombs contained bronze mirrors, ceremonial daggers, and jewelry made to last forever. In death, as in life, metal was a marker of identity and power. Rome did not copy the Etruscans outright, but it absorbed their methods. By the 7th century, iron began to overtake bronze in the Roman hills. It was cheaper, harder, and more widely available. Iron ploughs opened more land for farming. Iron tools cut timber, shaped stone, and built homes. And iron weapons, short swords, spearheads, and arrow tips armed the first Roman militias. This was still the regal period, when Rome was said to be ruled by kings. Some of these kings may never have existed, but the culture they represented was real. Bronze was used in ritual, not just in war. Religious sites in early Rome were marked with bronze fittings and tools. In one sanctuary, archaeologists discovered small bronze figurines, possibly offerings to a household god. Metal had meaning. It connected earth to sky, the human to the divine. By the 6th century, Rome was growing. It had trade networks, artisans, and craft districts along the banks of the Tiber River. Iron was smelted in small clay furnaces and worked by hand. Bronze was cast in reusable moulds. Tin was rare and valuable, likely imported from as far as Cornwall in the British Isles. Bronze was used to make weapons, but also to decorate shields and to mark public inscriptions. The oldest surviving Latin inscriptions are carved into bronze sheets. At this stage, Rome had no coinage. Currency came later, but the economy was already bound to metal. Wealth was measured in weight, and large bronze ingots, known as aes rud, served as the earliest units of exchange. These lumps of metal were passed by weight, not stamped. In a world without banks, trust began with iron and copper. Beneath the later marble structures of Rome lie layers of ash, slag, and rust. Remnants of early furnaces have been excavated under temples and homes. These finds tell a story of trial and repetition, of fire and patience. They show a society not yet imperial, but already organized, already industrious, already determined to transform what it found in the hills around it. Rome would go on to build roads and walls, to raise armies and columns. But it began with the sound of hammer on anvil, the heat of the forge, and the weight of bronze in a closed hand. Long before the Republic, long before the Empire, there was ore, and Rome learned how to use it. Chapter 2. The Iron Republic. By the late 6th century, before the Common Era, Rome had cast off its kings and declared itself a republic. It was a new form of government, ambitious and fragile, built on rotating officers, elected magistrates, and a senate that claimed to speak for the people. But the real foundations were not made of words. They were made of iron. If bronze had once signalled ritual and aristocratic status, iron now signalled function. It was the metal of the soldier, the labourer, the surveyor, and the engineer. The Republic expanded not with ceremony, but with steel in hand. The Roman infantry carried short swords known as gladii. These weapons were not decorative. They were forged in batches and issued by the state. The typical gladius was about 60 centimetres long. That is just under 2 feet. It was designed for stabbing, not slashing. Roman tactics relied on tight formations and disciplined strikes. The gladius matched the mindset, efficient, brutal, and replaceable. Iron was not limited to swords. Spears, javelins, arrow points, and daggers were all forged in standard patterns. Metal fittings reinforced shields. Helmets were braced with iron crossbars. Chainmail, known as lorica hamata, was made from thousands of interlocking iron rings. Soldiers were expected to provide their own arms, but as Rome grew wealthier and more organized, the state took control. Foundries near Rome, especially along the Tiber, began to produce arms at scale. Warehouses stored supplies. Distribution was planned. This was not yet a standing army, but it was a system. Away from battle, iron shaped the land. Farmers cleared fields with iron ploughs, hoes, and mattocks. Builders used iron chisels and hammers to carve stone for homes and temples. Roads were dug through hillsides with iron picks. Nails and hinges bound wooden carts and wagons. Iron clamps held aqueduct stones together. The infrastructure of the Republic, bridges, roads, ports, and foundations, was measured in stone, but made possible by iron. By the 3rd century, Rome was no longer a local city. It had pushed south toward Campania and north toward the Apennines. Each new conquest brought new sources of ore and new labour to extract it. Iron came from the hills of Etruria, from Samnium, and later from the Po Valley. Some mines were shallow pits, others reached deep into the ground with ladders, baskets, and crude ventilation shafts. Charcoal was used to fuel the furnaces. It burned hot, but it required wood in vast amounts. Forests near Rome were cut, and then more distant forests followed. Smelting iron was difficult. Too little heat, and the metal would not separate from the stone. Too much air, and the ore would oxidize. Skilled workers watched the colour of the flame and the smell of the smoke. They worked with bellows, clay crucibles, and tongs. Slag, the waste material, was dumped nearby. In many places across Italy, that slag still marks the sites of ancient forges. Iron also became a form of wealth. In the early Republic, there were no coins. Instead, bars of bronze and iron were used in trade. These were not shaped or decorated. They were weighed, not counted. Over time, as commerce expanded, stamped ingots began to appear. Some were marked with names or places of origin. Others were labelled for the Roman state. These objects were practical and symbolic. They proved that iron was not only a tool, it was a resource, an asset, and a language of value. Iron moved with armies and merchants alike. It crossed mountains and rivers. It travelled in wagons and on ships. It rusted in battlefields, and it endured in workshops. Wherever Rome went, iron followed. Or perhaps it was the other way around. The Republic grew through policy and war, but behind every law and every victory was a metal that made expansion possible. Iron did not appear in speeches. It appeared in calluses, in scars, in roadbeds and arrowheads. This was not yet the Rome of emperors, but it was the Rome that shaped them. Chapter 3. Bronze and Identity. Even as iron spread across battlefields and silver entered the treasury, bronze remained the metal Rome used to speak. It was not the rarest, nor the strongest, but for centuries it was the most expressive. Bronze covered temples, armed warriors, carried law, and preserved memory. It filled the spaces between war and worship, between daily use and eternal record. Made by combining copper and tin, bronze required trade from the beginning. Copper was available on the island of Elba and in parts of central Italy. Tin was much harder to find. It came through long-distance routes, sometimes from what is now southwestern Britain. By the 6th century before the Common Era, bronze was already circulating in the Italian peninsula, and the Romans, like their Etruscan neighbours, had begun to use it in both craft and ceremony. In early Roman society, bronze held civic, military, and spiritual weight. It was the material of weapons, armour, religious tools, public markers, and eventually coinage. Bronze helmets protected soldiers during the Republic's earliest campaigns. Spears and greaves were shaped in local forges. Even before iron became the primary metal for war, bronze defended the state. But bronze did more than protect. It represented. The first statues erected in Roman public spaces were not marble. They were bronze. They stood in forums and temples representing gods, ancestors, or political figures. Some honoured victories, others gave thanks. To cast a statue in bronze was to demand permanence. The process was precise. Artists created wax models, encased them in clay, then poured molten bronze into the mould. Once cooled, the outer shell was broken away. The statue was cleaned, polished, and often adorned with silver or gold. A successful casting was both a technical and a symbolic triumph. One of Rome's oldest legal inscriptions, the lapis niger, was mounted on a bronze base in the forum. Though damaged and only partly understood, it gives us the earliest Latin words preserved in metal. In early Rome, the written word had a medium, and that medium was bronze. Bronze also defined ritual. The Sali priests carried sacred bronze shields through the city in procession. Bronze cymbals, bells, and horns marked religious festivals. Sacrifices were prepared with bronze knives. Offerings to the gods, inscribed on small bronze plaques, were placed in temples or buried in sacred groves. Even curses were written on thin sheets of bronze, folded and hidden under thresholds or tossed into wells. In each case, the metal was a channel between the mortal and the divine. As Rome expanded, bronze became part of its diplomacy. Treaties with other cities were cast on bronze tablets. Laws were engraved and posted in public squares. These inscriptions did not simply announce, they declared authority in a language that could not be erased. The bronze tablet was heavier than parchment, but its weight was political. By the 3rd century, Rome began issuing coins made from bronze. These early coins, known as AS grave, were round, heavy, and marked with symbols of Roman power. A prow of a ship, the head of a god, a she-wolf with twins. Each coin weighed over 1/4 of a pound. Too large for pockets, they were traded by value and stored in bulk. But they set the foundation for later currencies. Bronze was the first metal to represent the Roman state in everyday life. Statues, coins, inscriptions, armor. Bronze touched all of them, but it also left its sound. Bronze bells called citizens to assemble. Bronze gongs marked the passage of time. The ringing of bronze echoed through temples, courtrooms, and markets. It gave Roman life a tone as well as a shape. Unlike iron, bronze does not rust easily. Many bronze objects have survived where iron ones have vanished. What Rome cast in bronze, it meant to last. Even in fragments, these objects still carry names, decrees, and memories. They speak across centuries in the language of alloy and fire. Rome would go on to embrace silver for coinage and gold for glory. But it was bronze that first gave the Republic its voice. Chapter 4: Silver and the State. By 300 BCE, Rome was no longer a regional city defending its borders. It had grown into a republic on the move, driven by conquest and hungry for control. As territories expanded and supply chains stretched across seas and mountains, bronze ingots became too heavy, too local, too slow. Rome needed a currency that could travel, be trusted, and represent the state with every exchange. That currency was silver. Silver had circulated in the ancient Mediterranean for centuries, especially among the Greek city-states. But it was not until 211 BCE, during the Second Punic War, that Rome issued its first standardized silver coin, the denarius. It weighed about 4 grams, carried the head of Roma on one side and a symbol of military might on the other, often a chariot or the figure of victory. In one coin, Rome presented its image, its strength, and its reach. It was not just a medium of exchange. It was a message in metal. To sustain this new monetary system, Rome needed silver in vast quantities, and it found it, as it often did, through conquest. After defeating Carthage, Rome seized control of the Iberian Peninsula, including some of the richest silver mines in the ancient world. These mines were concentrated in the southeastern region of what is now Spain, in places like Carthago Nova, modern-day Cartagena, and the Sierra Morena Mountains further inland. The mines were immense. Deep shafts cut into hillsides, reinforced with timber, lit by flickering lamps. Slaves, prisoners of war, and convicted criminals worked in brutal conditions. They used iron tools to hack through rock and carried sacks of ore on their backs. Above ground, the ore was crushed by stone rollers, washed in basins, and smelted in clay furnaces. Charcoal fires melted the rock, separating metal from slag. The resulting silver was cast into ingots, stamped, and shipped to Rome. Archaeological studies confirm the scale. At Rio Tinto in southern Spain, layers of slag and collapsed shafts tell the story of ancient industrial mining. Some estimates suggest these mines produce thousands of tons of silver over centuries. That silver flowed into Rome's coffers and out again in coinage that paid legions, bought grain, subsidized construction, and fueled the machinery of empire. The denarius became a workhorse of the Roman economy. It travelled from Britannia to Judea, from the Rhine to the Nile. It appeared in marketplaces, temples, and military outposts. In shipwrecks off the coast of Italy and North Africa, hoards of silver coins have been recovered, sometimes packed in amphorae, sometimes hidden under planks. These coins were not just used, they were carried, trusted, and counted upon. Yet silver was never just practical, it was political. Each coin bore not only the face of Roma, but later of the Republic's great generals. In the last century, BCE, coins began to feature living men. Pompey, Caesar, Brutus. It was a quiet revolution. To place one's own likeness on a coin was to claim authority, visibility, and permanence. When Octavian, later Augustus, rose to power, the denarius became a tool of propaganda. His image was everywhere, carried in every pocket, held in every hand. The face of the emperor became the face of the state. Silver also adorned elite Roman homes. Wealthy citizens collected silverware, bowls, goblets, plates, often engraved with mythological scenes or personal emblems. Religious rites used silver vessels to pour offerings or hold sacred oils. Silver became a mark of taste and reverence, visible on the dinner table and at the altar. But silver had its limits. As wars drained the treasury and military costs soared, Rome began to dilute the purity of its coins. By the end of the Republic, some denarii contained less than 50% silver. The currency looked the same, but its value was slipping. Inflation rose. Public trust wavered. Rome's economy, once strengthened by silver, began to feel its erosion. Still, the silver denarius endured. It remained the backbone of Roman commerce for centuries. It paid soldiers and artisans. It built roads and funded temples. It crossed rivers and oceans, bringing with it not just value, but identity. Where bronze declared tradition and iron enforced will, silver defined the Republic's ambition. It was the empire's mirror, stamped with power, passed from hand to hand, and minted with intent. Chapter 5. Gold and Glory. Gold was never Rome's everyday metal. It didn't build roads or equip legions. It didn't feed armies or fasten aqueducts. Gold had a different role. It was the symbol of victory, of favour, and of divine presence. If iron fought and silver governed, gold ruled. In the early days of the Republic, gold was rare. Rome had no major gold mines of its own. What little it used came through trade with the Etruscans, the Greeks, and tribes from the north. It appeared in jewellery, in religious offerings, and in diplomatic gifts. Some of the earliest gold objects found in Italy come not from Romans, but from their enemies. Gold torques, bracelets, and rings buried in tribal graves show how power was worn. That changed with expansion. By around 200 BCE, Rome was gaining access to gold through war. The wars against Carthage, a powerful city in what is now Tunisia, brought Roman forces into Spain, where gold could be panned from rivers and dug from hillsides. Later, in Gaul, Julius Caesar's armies captured massive hoards taken from Celtic temples and chiefs. Some finds held hundreds of coins, decorative pieces, and gilded weapons, all stripped from conquered sanctuaries and sent back to Rome. Still, Rome was careful with gold. It wasn't used for common purchases. Silver filled the markets. Gold was reserved for the Republic's most serious needs. The first official Roman gold coin was issued in 87 BCE, during a time of civil war. This coin was called the aureus. It weighed about 8 grams and was worth roughly 25 silver denarii. Few Romans ever held one. They were minted in small numbers, often for military use or large state payments. When an army needed to be paid, or a general needed to buy loyalty, gold spoke louder than silver. The message didn't stop with value. Gold was also a visual tool. In triumphal parades, victorious generals were crowned with golden wreaths. Gilded statues lined the forum. Shields, trophies, and inscriptions shone in the sun. Temples were decorated with golden ornaments, especially in places dedicated to Jupiter. For Rome, gold wasn't just wealth. It was light, honour, and power made visible. When the Republic gave way to emperors, gold rose higher still. Augustus minted the aureus in larger numbers and put his face on it. That was no small act. In the Old Republic, coins showed gods or personifications like Roma. Now they showed living rulers. Holding an aureus with Augustus's image, meant holding the state itself. Later, emperors followed his lead. Some distributed gold coins in public ceremonies as rewards or gestures of goodwill. These moments, called congeria, weren't charity, they were theatre. Over time, the coin itself changed. Nero reduced its weight, starting a pattern of debasement. Even so, the aureus remained the gold standard, literally. It was stored in treasuries, hoarded in temples, and kept by the wealthy as a reserve of power. The emperor's private vault, known as the fiscus, held vast quantities of gold, collected through taxes, conquest, and tribute. Rome's gold supply came from many fronts. In addition to Spain and Gaul, major sources were opened in the Balkans and later in Dacia, an area in what is now Romania. After Trajan conquered Dacia in 106 CE, cartloads of gold were brought to Rome. Scenes carved on Trajan's column show the spoils being marched through the streets. That Dacian gold helped fund years of construction, military campaigns, and state rituals. Gold didn't circulate widely. It concentrated in elite hands. But its meaning was everywhere. It appeared in medallions given to soldiers, in rings worn by officials, in cups used during sacrifices. Wealthy households had silver for dining. The very richest had gold. It wasn't a currency for markets. It was a marker of status, displayed and remembered. Today, gold hoards from the Roman world have been found across the empire, from villas in Gaul to fortresses in Syria. Some were buried for safety and never recovered. Others were offerings or heirlooms. Each tells a story about value, fear, loyalty, and legacy. Rome was built on iron. It was administered in silver, but it crowned itself in gold. Chapter 6. The Hidden Labour. Behind every Roman coin, weapon, aqueduct, and statue was a pair of hands, often unseen, often unfree. Rome's power may have been cast in metal, but it was shaped by labour. In mines, forges, and foundries, countless workers extracted and transformed the raw materials that built the empire. Their names were rarely recorded. Their work, though invisible in the written histories, was essential. Mining in the Roman world was hard, dangerous, and often deadly. Most metal came from conquered provinces, where the state or wealthy elites controlled large mining zones. In regions like Roman Spain, Dacia in modern-day Romania, and the Balkans, open pit and underground mines cut deep into the earth. Workers used iron picks and hammers to dig through stone, chasing seams of silver, iron, copper, and gold. Oil lamps offered dim light. The air filled with dust and heat. Deeper shafts reached temperatures that left men soaked in sweat within minutes. The labour force was drawn largely from the enslaved, from prisoners of war, and from convicted criminals. For many, the mine was a death sentence. Roman legal texts even refer to damnati ad metallum, those condemned to the mines. Collapses, rockfalls, toxic fumes from mineral dust and smelting fires, these were daily dangers. Children were sometimes used to access tight tunnels. In many regions, life expectancy for mining labourers was measured in months, not years. And yet the scale of these operations was massive. At Rio Tinto in southern Spain, mining slag still covers the ground for kilometres. At Rosia Montana in Dacia, entire hillsides were tunnelled, drained, and processed. Roman engineers constructed aqueducts not only for cities, but to supply mines with water for ore washing. Channels and sluices carried sediment downhill into separating tanks, where heavier metals could be filtered from the rock. Once the ore was extracted, the work shifted to smelting. Smelting sites were placed near mines, but also outside urban centres. Metallurgists, some enslaved, some free, heated the crushed ore in furnaces made from clay and stone, fired with charcoal. The smelting process required precision. a misjudged temperature could ruin a batch. Slag, the leftover waste, was scraped away with long-handled tools. The purified metal was then poured into moulds, forming rough bars or plates that could be transported and reused. In cities and military centres, metal changed hands again. Blacksmiths and artisans worked in noisy, smoky workshops. Bronze was melted and recast into statues, coins, and fittings. Iron was forged into tools, nails, hinges, weapons, and armour. Each item was shaped by hammer, cooled in water, filed smooth, and sometimes engraved with names or symbols. Many tools bear the marks of their makers, simple initials struck into the metal with pride. Metal workers had a complex place in Roman society. Some were enslaved, working under strict control. Others were freedmen, running workshops and training apprentices. Some were highly skilled and well regarded within their communities. In larger cities, metal workers formed guilds that managed training, contracts, and standards. Inscriptions from places like Pompeii mention blacksmiths who donated to temples or held civic office. Their craft was physical, but also intellectual. They calculated weight, managed fire, understood alloys, and delivered exact results. Metal shaped not just the military and economy, but religion. Sacred tools used in sacrifices, such as knives, incense burners, and temple doors, had to be made with care and precision. Many were crafted from bronze or silver. In some regions, old offerings were melted down and reforged into new ones. Even curse tablets, made from thin sheets of lead or bronze, were etched by hand, rolled up tightly, and hidden beneath thresholds or dropped into sacred springs. They were fragments of private fears and public vengeance written in metal. Despite their central role, labourers in metal were mostly anonymous in Roman literature. The great authors wrote of emperors, victories, and monuments, not of the soot-covered men who made them possible. Yet without these hands burned by furnaces, marked by hammers, and stiff from years of repetitive work, none of it could have existed. The empire's metals told stories of triumph and order. But buried beneath the gold and silver was another story, of exhausted workers in dark shafts, of smoke rising from forges, of anonymous fingerprints pressed into the molten foundation of Roman power. Chapter 7. Lead and the Poisoned City. Among all the metals used by the Romans, none was more widespread or more quietly destructive than lead. It lined their water pipes, sealed their roofs, filled their cooking pots, and glazed their ceramics. It was useful, abundant, and toxic. Today, many historians and scientists point to lead as a hidden danger in Roman daily life. To the Romans, though, it was just another tool of civilization. The Latin word for lead was plumbum, and it gave its name to plumbing. Roman engineers discovered that lead could be cast easily, shaped without cracking, and used in thin sheets or thick pipes. In aqueduct-fed cities, lead piping distributed water to homes, baths, fountains, and public toilets. Massive lead conduits have been found beneath the streets of Pompeii, Ostia, and Rome itself. The pipes carried clean water, but also absorbed it. Over time, particles of lead flaked off into the flow. Lead was also used to create tanks and liners for water cisterns. Because it resisted corrosion, it seemed perfect for the job. Workers shaped sheets of lead into boxes, sealed them with melted joints, and connected them with lead clamps. The same skills were used on rooftops, where lead sheets covered tiles and sealed gutters. In kitchens, lead appeared again. Many Roman pots and pans contained traces of lead from their glazes or soldering. Some wine was even boiled in lead vessels to concentrate flavour and sweetness. This process could create lead acetate, a compound sweet to the taste, and poisonous to the body. Roman winemakers may not have understood the chemistry, but they knew the results. Sweet wine sold better. The state also used lead for more visible functions. public inscriptions and dedications were often cast in lead and set into stone monuments. Thousands of lead curse tablets, thin sheets etched with angry or desperate appeals to the gods, have been discovered in wells, tombs, and temples. These tablets record everything from lost property to romantic betrayal. They were folded, pierced with nails, and buried where divine forces might hear them. But the largest use of lead was in coinage. During times of financial strain, especially in the 3rd century CE, Rome began to heavily debase its silver currency. As silver content dropped, copper and lead were added. Some coins that looked silver on the outside were mostly base metal within. This made them easier to produce but harder to trust. It also introduced more lead into the hands of the public. Lead mining itself was widespread across the empire. Some of the richest sources were in Britain, particularly in what is now Derbyshire and Somerset. Roman engineers cut deep into hills, drained water with wooden pumps, and processed the ore with fire. The byproduct was slag, dumped in heaps near mining settlements. Traces of lead dust have been found in ice cores in Greenland, confirming how far Roman pollution travelled. The health effects are still debated, but ancient texts provide clues. Some Roman authors noticed symptoms of fatigue, mental confusion, and stomach problems among workers or nobles who handled lead often. Pliny the Elder warned about toxic fumes from smelting. Vitruvius, the Roman architect, even argued that terracotta pipes were healthier than lead ones, though his advice was not widely followed. Among elites, the danger was subtle. Wealthy homes had elaborate water systems with lead fixtures. Banquets served wine stored in lead-soldered vessels. Cosmetic creams and white face powders often used lead compounds to achieve the pale look that fashion demanded. Exposure accumulated. The symptoms were gradual: declining fertility, headaches, anemia, and in extreme cases, madness. Lead was not a villain in the Roman world. It was a convenience, a craft material, a state resource. But its cost, invisible to those who used it, may have been paid in health and lifespan. The poisoned city did not know it was poisoned. It poured clean water through lead pipes, toasted victories with tainted wine, and sealed its monuments with a metal that whispered danger in every drop. As for the full story of Roman water, hygiene, and the public bathhouse, that tale deserves its own focus. In a future documentary, we'll trace how the same aqueducts that fed the pipes of the empire also shaped its rituals of cleanliness, community, and identity. Chapter 8: The Military Forge. Rome's military was more than legions marching in formation. It was an industrial machine. Behind every sword drawn in battle and every catapult hurled across walls stood a vast system of extraction, manufacturing, and logistics. Metal was the skeleton of that system, and the forge was its beating heart. From the earliest days of the Republic, Rome depended on iron. It was cheap, strong, and available across the Italian peninsula. But it wasn't raw ore that won battles. It was forged iron, heated, hammered, shaped, and hardened into tools of war. Roman soldiers were equipped not only with weapons, but with gear: helmets, shields, pila, belt buckles, tent stakes, even cooking utensils. All of it required metal, and all of it was made somewhere, by someone. Roman armories were not random workshops. They were organized centers of production. In some cities, especially near military frontiers, entire quarters were dedicated to ironwork. Inscriptions from Gaul, Pannonia, and along Hadrian's Wall in Britain mentioned smiths employed by the army, fabricatories, who repaired weapons and armor on site. These men, some enlisted, some civilian contractors, kept the machines of war running long after campaigns began. Iron was the mainstay, but bronze played a role too. Bronze fittings secured armor. Bronze scales were used in certain types of segmentata. Officer gear often had decorative bronze elements, crest holders, greaves, or harness plates. In the imperial period, some ceremonial weapons were made entirely of polished bronze, meant to impress more than injure. Copper, tin, and iron were sourced from across the empire. Mines in Spain, the Alps, and the Balkans supplied the raw materials. Transport was coordinated through a military logistics system, the cursus publicus, that moved carts of ingots along Roman roads under guard. Way stations stocked supplies. Foundries near fortresses melted and recast the metal into usable forms. The result was not just a war machine, but a production line. Catapults and ballistae added another layer of complexity. These machines needed specialized metal parts, winches, tension springs, locking mechanisms. Archaeological finds show how standardized many of these components became. Engineers designed them to be assembled quickly, sometimes even in the field. Manuals like those attributed to Vitruvius outlined how to size and balance torsion-powered engines. Roman siegecraft wasn't improvised. It was engineered. Coins struck for the army were also part of this metallic ecosystem. Soldiers were paid in silver denarii and, later, in debased coins with traces of copper and lead. These coins travelled with legions and circulated in forts, camps, and border towns. Hoards buried in former military zones tell stories of sudden retreats, garrison pay chests, and economic networks tied directly to conquest. The military also absorbed tools from civilian metalwork. Roman shovels, hammers, saws, and tongs, many made of iron, served double duty in construction and combat. Legionaries were trained to build as well as fight. They dug ditches, cut roads, raised walls, and bridged rivers, all with tools forged in the same heat that made swords. In the empire's later centuries, as threats increased, so did production. Workshops attached to military zones grew in size. The arms industry became state-sponsored. Diocletian's reforms in the late 3rd century CE included strict control over metal workers, many of whom were bound to their professions by law. Leaving the trade could result in punishment. The empire recognized that smiths were as essential as soldiers. Yet for all this output, Roman metalworking remained a craft. No two swords were exactly alike. Armour bore maker's marks, test stamps, and field repairs. Inscriptions scratched into helmets or belt plates reveal names, unit numbers, even battlefield slogans. These weren't just objects, they were identities. In war, it was not just courage that carried Rome forward. It was iron, fire, and the forge. The sound of hammer on anvil echoed behind every frontier. The empire marched on metal feet. Chapter 9. Imperial Alchemy. To the Romans, metal was more than a material. It was a symbol of permanence, a marker of power, and, in some cases, a source of mystery. As the empire matured, Roman elites and thinkers began to explore metals not just as tools of war or currency, but as objects of transformation, belief, and even philosophy. This was the world of imperial alchemy, where metallurgy met meaning. Alchemy in the Roman world was a mix of observation, experimentation, and mysticism. It was not yet the science of modern chemistry, but it wasn't pure superstition either. Thinkers like Pliny the Elder and Dioscorides catalogued minerals, metals, and processes for refining and combining them. Egyptian, Greek, and Mesopotamian traditions merged in Roman texts, forming the early roots of what would become medieval and Renaissance alchemy. Gold, unsurprisingly, was central. It was seen not just as wealth, but as purity itself, untarnishable, incorruptible. Philosophers marveled at its resistance to rust and decay. It became a symbol of the eternal, the divine, and the imperial. Emperors wore gold laurel crowns, issued gold coins and adorned temples with it. In religious rituals, gold vessels carried sacred liquids. It was more than rare, it was morally superior. But the fascination did not stop at admiration. Alchemists across the Roman world, particularly in Alexandria and Asia Minor, began asking whether base metals could be changed into gold. The idea that copper or lead could be purified into gold was not a metaphor. It was a challenge, a pursuit, and for some, a spiritual journey. To do this, they studied the behavior of metals in fire. They recorded how ores changed color, how fumes rose, how alloys responded to heat. They documented recipes for purifying mercury, for making imitation silver from tin, for creating dyes and pigments from mineral bases. The tools of their trade were crucibles, bellows, glass vessels, and mortars. They observed. They experimented. They believed. Among the surviving works from this time is the Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra, not the Queen of Egypt, but a likely female alchemist writing in the early centuries of the Common Era. Her texts combine symbolic diagrams with practical techniques. She spoke of transformation not just of metals, but of the soul. For her and others, alchemy was a bridge between the physical and the metaphysical. The imperial court itself was not blind to these ideas. By the 3rd century, emperors faced economic decline, inflation, and a shrinking supply of precious metals. Some rulers turned to alchemists and metallurgists for solutions. Could gold be manufactured? Could old coins be treated or plated to appear more valuable? Debasement of currency was a state tactic, and alchemy offered both techniques and justifications. One method was mercury gilding. Artisans coated bronze statues or coins in a thin layer of gold by binding it with mercury, then evaporating the mercury with heat. The result looked like solid gold, but weighed less and cost less. It was a visual illusion, and one used on everything from imperial busts to architectural details. It also exposed workers to mercury vapor, another invisible cost of Roman brilliance. The Emperor Aurelian, ruling in the 3rd century, reportedly banned the production of purple-dyed silks for private citizens, not only to preserve imperial exclusivity, but also because some dye recipes involved costly metals and alchemical treatments. His reign, like others of the time, illustrates how tightly metals, symbolism, and statecraft had become intertwined. Alchemy also entered Roman medicine. Metals like antimony and arsenic were ground into powders and added to treatments. Lead compounds were used in eye salves. Copper was thought to cure ulcers. Doctors combined metal salts with herbal mixtures, relying on trial and tradition more than theory. Healing and metallurgy overlapped, especially in the writings of Galen and Scribonius Largus. Some temples even combined healing and metalworking, shrines where the divine and the chemical coexisted. But for all the innovation, Roman alchemy remained constrained by limits it did not fully understand. Transmutation of metals into gold never succeeded, though it inspired centuries of future attempts. What endured was the idea that metals held secrets, if only one had the patience, the faith, and the fire to unlock them. In Rome, the forge was a workshop, a battlefield supply line, and sometimes a laboratory of dreams. Here, the hammer struck not just iron, but imagination. And through it, the empire chased eternity in the shimmer of molten gold. Chapter 10. The Last Echoes of the Forge. By the 4th century, the sound of hammer and anvil still echoed across the Roman world, but it was growing faint. The empire's outer walls trembled, its markets grew uncertain, and its metals, once so abundant, became harder to mine, to mint, and to protect. The great metallurgical machine that had fueled expansion and powered empire was aging, and with it, the Roman mastery over metal began to wane. This decline was not uniform. In Constantinople, metalworkers still produced golden icons and bronze doors. In Ravenna, Mosaic artisans used gold leaf to capture divine light. But across much of the Western Empire, coinage was debased to the point of distrust. Silver vanished from daily use. Copper coins lost weight. Some carried just a thin wash of precious metal over a base core. People began to hoard older currency, preferring the known purity of past generations. The state attempted reforms. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices in 301 CE tried to stabilize inflation and fix the value of goods, metals included. But enforcement was inconsistent, and economic strain continued. The mines of Spain, once rich with iron, silver, and lead, were overworked and underdefended. Raiders targeted shipments. Labourers fled taxation or servitude. Skilled smiths became harder to replace. Barbarian incursions also disrupted the metallic economy. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 CE, they stripped the city of gold and bronze, melted down statues, and pried fittings from buildings. The Vandals did the same in Carthage, today located in modern Tunisia. Churches, villas, and public monuments were looted for metal. Even tombs were opened to extract the precious or the useful. Yet Roman metallurgy did not vanish. It transformed. In post-Roman kingdoms, some techniques survived. Frankish smiths adopted Roman patterns in sword-making. In Britain, Roman scrap was recycled into Anglo-Saxon brooches and buckles. In Gaul, Latin inscriptions on iron tools continued well into the early medieval period. Monastic communities preserved elements of Roman alchemical texts. The forge remained, though the empire that built it had crumbled. One of the clearest signs of Rome's metallic legacy is in its ruins. The iron clamps that once held marble together were stolen, leaving telltale grooves. Bronze doors from temples were cut out and refitted to cathedrals. Statues were recast into bells or weaponry. Even the Colosseum lost its structural pins to looters who pulled the iron from its bones. The symbolic weight of metal also endured. Medieval rulers crowned themselves with gold, minted coins in the Roman fashion, and held relics in silver reliquaries. Alchemists continued the Roman dream of transmutation. Some even referenced Roman sources in their recipes, believing that the ancients had come close to discovering eternal truths locked in metal. Meanwhile, Christian doctrine gave new meanings to old materials. Gold was now the metal of heaven. Iron, once the strength of empire, became the metal of martyrdom, used in nails and chains. Lead, long associated with infrastructure and medicine, faded into suspicion, tied to decay and decline. What Rome left behind was not just a system of metallurgy, but a mythology of metal. Gold became imperial memory. Iron became conquest. Bronze became artistry. And lead, silent and subtle, lingered in the cracks of aqueducts and the lining of forgotten pipes. The last echoes of the Roman forge were not heard in victory, but in transformation. As the empire gave way to kingdoms and temples to cathedrals, the tools and symbols of Roman metallurgy were reshaped. They crossed centuries, borders, and beliefs. Some changed meaning. Others remained as they were, quiet testaments to a world built in fire and held together by awe. Yet the story is not only one of preservation and reuse. It is also one of inspiration. The techniques, ambitions, and even the failures of Roman metalworking laid the groundwork for what would come later. Renaissance artists and engineers, from Brunelleschi to Da Vinci, studied Roman bronze castings and iron structures. Enlightenment chemists traced the roots of their disciplines through Roman observations and terminology. In the industrial age, when Europe forged a new world from steel, it did so in the long shadow of Roman iron. The empire that once turned earth into empire left behind more than ruins. It left behind a method, a mindset, and a memory, a civilization that forged its history in metal, and in doing so, cast a mould that would shape the future. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the metals of ancient Rome. From humble iron nails to golden coins, from the secret weight of lead in the aqueducts to the shimmering illusions of imperial alchemy, the Roman world was quite literally built in metal. These were not just materials, they were instruments of power, belief, and survival. And each had a role to play in shaping a civilization that would echo through millennia. At History's Edge, every documentary we produce is the result of careful research, double-sourced facts, and a commitment to truth. We don't rely on flashy reenactments or CGI spectacle. We let the history speak for itself, and we build each narrative to stand on solid ground, just like the roads, aqueducts, and forges the Romans once laid. If you found value in this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep history sharp, honest, and alive. And if you'd like to hear more, our next documentary will explore the world of Roman baths and hygiene, a subject as surprisingly complex as it is revealing. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and thank you again for listening.